In this lesson, we're going to go over what you should expect from this series of videos. So in terms of topics covered, we're going to cover a pretty broad range of material. We're going to go over footprinting and reconnaissance, where you get an idea of what's involved in the engagement that you're working on and information about the target that you are engaged with. We're going to talk about networking fundamentals, and here we're going to get our hands dirty with packets and understanding TCP/IP at a deeper level, and also understanding how the different protocols work and why they work that way. We're going to talk about cryptography, where we talk about different cryptographic ciphers. We're going to deal with web encryption, so SSL and TLS. We're going to talk about certificates and creation of certificates and how they actually operate. We're going to talk about public key cryptography. We're also going to deal with scanning and enumeration, so Nmap, and dealing with Windows servers and using SNMP and LDAP and all of that sort of stuff. We're going to be talking about penetration, where we deal with different ways of getting into systems, and also go over using Metasploit, which is an exploit framework. And we're going to talk about how to use Metasploit to actually get into systems and make use of the exploits that they have available. We're going to talk about malware, so viruses and worms and rootkits and all of that sort of stuff. We're going to look at different pieces of malware and how you would pull that apart in order to understand what it's doing and potentially make use of that malware during a ethical hacking engagement. We're going to talk about different types of denial of service attacks and the difference between a denial of service attack and a distributed denial of service attack. And there is a difference there. So we're going to go over DOS attacks. We're going to talk about web application hacking and the types of tools that you would use during web application hacking, the different vulnerabilities that web applications have, and how to make use of and exploit those vulnerabilities. We're going to talk about wireless networking, how to probe wireless networks, what wireless networks are doing, and how to secure wireless networks. We are going to talk a little bit about detection evasion. And to be honest with you, detection evasion kind of comes up in a lot of different areas through many of the topics. We're also going to talk about programming attacks and how to protect against and prevent programming attacks. Now, the approach that I'm going to be taking in this series of videos is, wherever possible, we're going to be using a hands-on approach. So I'm going to show you the actual tools. I'm going to make use of the tools and do some demonstrations on how they actually work. I am a big believer in getting your hands dirty as the best way to learn anything. So as we go through this series of videos, I strongly encourage you to get access to the tools that I'm going to be demonstrating wherever possible, and dig in and get your hands dirty along with me. There are places where we're going to be going over theoretical material, and I'm not a big fan of PowerPoint slides, but sometimes they are necessary in order to convey certain types of information. So wherever possible, I'm going to minimize their use, but you will run across places where they're just a necessary evil, and we're going to have to go through some slideware in order to get some particular points across that are primarily of a theoretical nature. So that's the approach that we'll be taking through this series of videos, and I hope that you have fun as we go along the way. What is hacking? The Internet Engineering Task Force is responsible for maintaining documentation about protocols and various specifications and processes and procedures regarding anything on the Internet. They have a series of documents called Request for Comments, or RFCs. RFC 1389 says, "A hacker is a person who delights in having an intimate understanding of the internal workings of a system, computers, and computer networks in particular." While the expression hackers may go back a long time and have many different connotations or definitions, as far as computers go, some of the earliest hackers were members of the Tech Model Railroad Club at MIT, And those people and the various things that they did and were involved in are detailed in Stephen Levy's book, Hackers. For our purposes, we'll be talking about other types of hackers, although the spirit of what we do goes back to those early days. The definition of hacking or hackers changed, particularly in the 1980s, and in part as a result of a couple of people. Robert T. Morris was a Cornell graduate student who unleashed a piece of software that was called a worm on what was an early version of the internet. That worm went on to cause a lot of damage and create a lot of downtime on systems across the country and across the world. The Morris worm did end up resulting in something good, however. The Computer Emergency Response Team at Carnegie Mellon was created primarily in response to the Morris worm. Kevin Mitnick is another well-known hacker who was responsible for various acts of computer crime over a couple of decades. He was first convicted in 1988. So the definition of hacker or hacking moved from something benign to something far more sinister. In popular culture, we see hacking or hackers in the movies War Games, the movie Hackers, of course, the Matrix movies, where you can see if you look really closely, they use a tool called Nmap, which we will go into the use of in great detail later on. Also the movie Sneakers, the movie Swordfish, and on television, in addition to other places, you can see the agents at NCIS regularly doing things like cracking complex cryptography in just a matter of seconds or minutes. So what is hacking really? Hacking is about a deep understanding of something, particularly with relation to computers and computing. It's also about exploring and the joy of learning new things and understanding them very clearly and being able to manipulate those things in ways that maybe other people haven't before. It's also about digging into problems to find solutions in creative and interesting ways, and sometimes finding problems where there weren't problems previously. That's a little bit about what is hacking. In this lesson, we'll be talking about why you may want to learn to hack. Sometimes you may want to hack just for fun. As discussed previously, hacking is a tradition that goes back several decades at MIT, even preceding the computer-related definition of hacking. MIT has a long and storied history of hacking, sometimes of a computer-related nature, which in this case happens to be true, sometimes of a non-computer-related instance. Here, MIT's homepage has been hacked, or you might say defaced, to indicate that Disney is buying MIT. This was an April Fool's Day prank in 1998. And again, this is just kind of for the fun of it. Sometimes you want to make a social or political point. In this case, again, MIT. Bill Gates donated some money that allowed MIT to have a new building. He was coming to MIT to visit and to speak, and the Microsoft Windows systems that were installed in the entryway at the building were hacked to be running Linux instead. And you can see here Tux the Penguin is saying, "Welcome to the William H. Gates building." And again, that's some students who decided they wanted to make a point about Linux and Microsoft and Windows to Bill Gates. Sometimes you hack just for the challenge. Here's an example, again at MIT, where some students turned the facade of a building into a Tetris game board. This was a reasonably difficult hack, and the students went after it just for the challenge of completing it, just so they could have some pride of ownership and to be able to say that they were able to pull this off in spite of its difficulties and its challenges and all of the obstacles and planning that had to go into it. And they were able to pull it off, and they have those bragging rights now. So that was one that was just for the challenge of doing it. Sometimes you want to hack to prevent theft. And this is where we get more specifically into computer-related hacking. You'll see a lot of articles and stories in the news over the last few years about cybercrime. And here's an example. Data theft compromised fewer than 1.5 million cards for Global Payments. So there are some attackers who got into this company, Global Payments, and they were able to pull about 1.5 million credit card numbers during an intrusion there. So what you may want to do is you may want to learn how to hack in order to find holes in your own systems or applications, or your employer's systems or applications, so that you can fix those holes and prevent these compromises from happening because of the reputational hit that your company would have to take, or because of the loss of customers, or because that loss of customers may eventually lead to the company going out of business, which means you lose your job. So here's a good reason to hack. You may want to find all of the problems that exist in your systems before putting them out and deploying them so that you can keep these attackers from getting in and stealing critical or sensitive information. Sometimes you may want to hack to get there before the bad guys. Same sort of idea as the last one we were just talking about. Here's some attack code that was published for critical Internet Explorer flaw. There are a number of people in the world who go out looking for these flaws. They call themselves security researchers. They get in touch with vendors after they've found a flaw or a bug and work with the vendor to get it fixed. What they end up with is a bit of a reputation. They get a name for themselves. That name recognition may end up getting them a job or some speaking engagements or a book deal. Any number of ways that you could cash in on name recognition from finding these sorts of bugs and getting them fixed. So you want to get there before the bad guys. You may think you're helping out a vendor. You may want to just make a name for yourself. And you want to find these sorts of bugs before the bad guys do. Because the thing about the bad guys finding them is they don't announce them. They don't get them fixed. And that makes everybody a little less secure. Finally, you may want to protect yourself. Hacked companies fight cyber criminals. This is a news headline from June 18th, 2012. We're starting to see these sorts of news headlines show up as companies are starting to retaliate against attackers. In order to retaliate against attackers, you need to be able to have the same sorts of skills and techniques and knowledge and experience that those attackers have. Or your company may want you to learn to hack, or the company may want to bring in people who are skilled at these sorts of activities so that they can attack the attackers, and hopefully you end up with a more steely exterior and you get a reputation for not being a company that people want to go after. And those are several reasons why you may want to hack. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about different types of hacking. The first type of hacking that I want to discuss is ethical hacking, which is really what we're going to be talking about through the rest of these lessons. Now, an ethical hacker is somebody who thinks like a black hat hacker or thinks like somebody who's intent on breaking into your system, but follows a moral compass that's more in line with probably the majority of the population. So their intent isn't to do bad things. Their intent is to look for bad things and get them fixed so that bad things don't happen. Ethical hackers aren't out to destroy anything, and they're not out to break anything unless it's deemed to be acceptable as part of the engagement and also necessary in order to demonstrate a particular vulnerability to the organization that they are working with. So that's an ethical hacker. And there is a certification that's available from the EC Council. It's a certified ethical hacker. And, if you find certifications valuable and this sort of thing is what you want to do, pursuing a certified ethical hacker may be something that you want to look into. Now let's talk about black hat hackers. There's certainly plenty of cases of black hat hackers through the years. This guy right here is a particularly good example, probably because he was a black hat for a lot of years. His goal was to cause mischief and to steal where necessary and to just be engaged in the lifestyle of being a hacker and doing whatever was necessary to continue doing that, whether it crossed moral or ethical boundaries or not. So Kevin Mitnick here was involved for well over a decade in computer crime and was finally picked up by the FBI, and he was charged and prosecuted, and he was eventually convicted of some of the activities that he was involved with. Now, you may be able to argue that Kevin is a gray hat hacker as well. And a gray hat hacker is somebody who kind of skirts the line between black and white hat hacking. And white hat hacking is really what an ethical hacker is. So instead of saying ethical hacker, you could say white hat hacker. It's the same idea. A white hat hacker is somebody who hacks for good, if you want to think of it like that, if you want to think about it as good versus evil. And what they really are doing is they're in it for the technical challenge. They're looking to make things better, make things more efficient, improve them in some way. A black hat hacker is out for the money, for the thrill. It's really a criminal activity. A gray hat hacker is somebody who may employ the tactics and techniques of a black hat hacker, but have sort of a white hat focus. In other words, they're going to do things that may be malicious and destructive in nature, but the reason they are doing it is to improve the security posture of an organization that they are working with. So you can see there's actually a book called Gray Hat Hacking. It's a pretty good book, and it details a lot of the tactics and strategies and techniques that we'll be going over in subsequent lessons. Now, one other type of hacking that I want to talk about is this thing called hacktivism, and you'll find hacktivism all over the place. And one example in the last year or so, certainly in recent memory, is Lulz Security. And you could argue that Lulz is actually a response to another type of hacktivism. An organization called Anonymous started hacking companies like Sony to protest their involvement in a lawsuit regarding a PS3 hacker. Lulz Security was supposedly protesting the treatment of Anonymous, or was hacking in support of this group Anonymous. So they hacked a number of companies and did things like pulled information, usernames, and passwords from databases at these companies. And they said the reason was to shine a light on the security of these companies, and also theoretically to embarrass the companies with their weak or poor security postures. The problem with what they were doing, though, was they were posting information that they found online, and that information often included details about the customers for these particular corporations. And for an ethical hacker or a white hat hacker, that would cross the boundary of causing harm. So there's no reason for me as an ethical hacker to post information in a public forum about somebody because I could be doing damage to them. In this case, Lulz Security and Anonymous, but specifically Lulz Security, were engaged in a form of hacktivism. And what they were doing was not only damaging to the corporations, that certainly was detrimental to those people. So different types of hackers, different types of hacking. We've got ethical or white hat hacking. We've got black hat, gray hat, and then finally we've got hacktivism. It's really the goals and the means that vary from one to the next. This lesson is about the importance of being ethical and ethical behavior. One really important reason for exhibiting ethical behavior and being ethical is that it inspires trust, and trust is a really important thing when you're looking for people to engage you in the activity of ethical hacking. They want to make sure that you are not going to exceed the bounds of your authority, and also that you're not going to do something that's going to damage their infrastructure or their reputation or any of their systems or critical data. As with any testing, hacking comes with risks. and it's important to always get permission before you do anything with a client or any sort of engagement. Here's an example here of an instance where someone didn't get permission and things got a little out of hand. Robert Morris Jr., also called RTM, was a graduate student at Cornell, and he wrote what was probably the first internet worm, and certainly the first that had a lot of notoriety. Morris said that the worm got out of his control, and he had originally expected that it was only going to stay in the lab where he was doing some work. Instead, it got through what was then the entire internet and took down a large number of systems. Now, one of the good things that came out of this was Carnegie Mellon decided that they would create the first computer emergency response team. But in the meantime, lots of users were without any ability to get to systems or get to the internet at large. So again, it's really important to get permission before you do anything. It's also really important to know what you've agreed to do. So when you get permission, you need to make sure that it's very clear what it is you've agreed to. You need to understand what the scope of your authority is and what systems you're allowed to touch and systems that you are not allowed to touch. As I mentioned earlier, hacking, as with any testing, comes with risks. And here's an example of the risk that you take with any sort of computer testing. A worker at United Airlines was doing some systems testing, and there was an error that occurred, and as a result, about 300 flights were impacted, either delayed or canceled. So lots of people were impacted due to this one error that occurred. No matter how careful you are, there's always a risk that you're going to have some negative impact on a system. Because of that, you also want to make sure that you are communicating closely and carefully with the client or the company that you are working with. You want to make sure they know what it is you're doing and when you're doing it so that they can communicate to any customers that there's testing going on and there's a possibility for outage. So again, it's certainly in the title, ethical hacking, but I can't stress enough how important being ethical is to this whole process and the work that you're undergoing. In this lesson, we'll be talking about legal issues associated with ethical hacking. I don't want you to get the impression that ethical hacking is all sweetness and light and just endless fun with no repercussions. There are significant repercussions with these types of activities, and it's important to become aware of them. One of the repercussions is that there are laws around the world that prohibit this type of behavior, specifically because it can be used to damage infrastructure or companies or take systems down and cause financial impacts to businesses and companies. So we're going to go over some of the laws that you should be familiar with. This is by no means all of them, but just to give you a taste of what's out there. The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act was originally passed in 1984 and has been amended a couple of times. One of the important things here is in the very beginning of it, whoever having knowingly accessed a computer without authorization or exceeding authorized access. So they're making illegal unauthorized use of computer systems. And that's exactly what you are doing with ethical hacking if you don't have an agreement in place with your employer so that they know what you're doing and how you're going about doing it. We've talked about scope. Scope has to do with exceeding authorized access. So again, we go back to you want to make sure that you know what you're authorized to do and how far you are authorized to go. Going beyond that can not only get you in trouble with your employer, but it can get you in trouble with the law as well. Now, this law goes on to talk about all sorts of other activities that you can't do, like knowingly and with intent to defraud a protected computer without authorization. intentionally without authorization to access any non-public computer of a department or agency of the United States. So there's a lot of detail in this particular law, and it's worthwhile being aware and familiar with what it covers. It's not the only federal law that protects against these types of activities, however. We have the National Information Infrastructure Protection Act that talks about whoever having knowingly accessed a computer without authorization or exceeding authorized access, and that has to do with fraud and related activities. Sounds very familiar if you're familiar with the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. What they did was they basically took the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and did some targeted work in order to make sure that national infrastructure was protected. So that's the United States, and we have several laws, not only federal laws, but state laws as well, that you need to be aware of if you are practicing these types of activities. There are laws around the rest of the world as well. One that made news in 2007 was in Germany. They passed a computer crime law that made it illegal to possess the tools that we'll be talking about in this series of lessons. There are a number of other activities that it has made illegal as well, but that's a really big one. So if you're doing work in Germany, just having these tools, and that includes creating tools that are like this, just having these tools in some fashion is illegal. You can see here on the Slashdot article, a similar law was proposed for the United Kingdom, but it was modified after outcry from the industry. So, as I said, there are laws in the United States, there are laws around the world that you need to be aware of if you are engaged in ethical hacking activities. A couple of big examples of cases where people thought they were doing research or claimed that they thought they were doing research and ran afoul of the law. You may have heard of Mafia Boy. In 2000, he took down several prominent websites with what at the time was the first known distributed denial of service attack. And he attacked CNN, Yahoo, E-Trade, Dell, Amazon, and eBay. He claimed to have been doing research for a security tool that he was working on. I